I'm writing this from a Motel 6 off I-75, about 300 miles from where I used to live. The curtains are drawn, and I've shoved a towel under the door gap. I need to get this down while the details are still sharp, before the exhaustion finally takes me. For the last 3.5 years, I worked as the sole night caretaker for Pine Ridge Memorial Gardens. It's a massive, sprawling property, 42 acres of rolling Kentucky hills, established back in 1904. During the day, it's actually beautiful. You have the weeping willows, the pristine marble angels, the meticulously manicured bluegrass. But from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., when the wrought iron gates are locked and the fog rolls off the river, it becomes a very different place. I took the job because I'm an insomniac and I prefer silence. The pay was $18.50 an hour, mostly to drive a beat-up 2014 Ford maintenance truck around the perimeter and make sure local teenagers weren't drinking beer in the mausoleums. It was boring, solitary work, which was exactly what I wanted. My routine was absolute clockwork. I'd arrive at 9:45 p.m., relieve the evening guard Dave, and do my first full patrol at 10:30 p.m. The cemetery is divided into 12 sections. Sections 1 through 8 are the high-end plots, family estates, upright monuments, the stuff that costs more than my truck. But the further back you go, the older and sadder it gets. The problem started in Section 9. We call it Potter's Field. It sits at the very rear of the property, bordering a steep, overgrown ravine that drops off into dense woods. The graves there date back to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. There are no granite headstones in Section 9, just rows of small, flat concrete markers, most of them sunken into the earth, bearing numbers instead of names. I always hated patrolling Section 9. The floodlights from the main building don't reach that far back, so it's pitch black unless there's a full moon. The air back there always feels different, too heavy and damp, like walking into a cellar that hasn't been opened in decades. It smells of wet rot and stagnant water, even in the middle of a drought. Last Tuesday, October 14th, I was doing my 2 a.m. rounds. I drove the truck down the gravel path, the headlights cutting through the mist, and parked at the edge of the ravine to do a foot patrol. It was quieter than usual. Normally, you hear the highway in the distance, or the cicadas buzzing in the ravine. That night, there was nothing. Just the crunch of my boots on the dead leaves and the sound of my own breathing. I shone my flashlight across the rows of sunken markers, just sweeping the area out of habit. That's when the beam caught something that didn't belong. In the far corner, near a plot that had been empty for as long as I'd worked there, the grass was disturbed. It wasn't just messy, it looked wrong. I walked over, my grip tightening on the heavy Maglite flashlight. I wasn't scared yet, just annoyed. I assumed it was a coyote or maybe kids digging for a haunted souvenir. But when I got close enough to see the ground clearly, I stopped cold. I checked my watch. The glowing green digits read 2:17 a.m. The spot in question was a patch of earth I'd nicknamed the blank. It was the only plot in Section 9 that didn't have a concrete marker, just a gap between grave 104 and grave 106. In the 3 years I'd walked this line, the blank had always been flat, overgrown with the same crabgrass and clover as the rest of the yard. But now, there was a hole. It wasn't huge, maybe 8 inches across, but it was the way the dirt was arranged that made my stomach turn over. If a dog or a person digs a hole, they scatter the dirt, they kick it backward or shovel it to the side. There's a directionality to it. This was different. The soil was piled in a perfect, uniform ring around the opening, like a volcanic crater. The earth hadn't been scooped out. It had been pushed out. Whatever had made this hole had come from underneath. I crouched down, shining my light directly into the opening. It went straight down, disappearing into the darkness. No roots, no rocks, just smooth, compacted clay walls. Groundhog, I muttered to myself, my voice sounding too loud in the dead silence. Just a damn groundhog. I was lying to myself, and I knew it. Groundhogs don't dig straight down through compacted grave clay, and they definitely don't create perfectly symmetrical rims of displaced earth. But I needed a reason to stop staring at it, so I stood up and walked back to the truck to grab the flathead shovel from the tool rack. The air felt colder now. The mist from the river was creeping up the ravine bank, curling around my ankles like white smoke. I didn't want to be in Section 9 anymore. I started shoveling the loose dirt back into the hole. It was heavy, wet clay, the kind that sticks to your boots and makes a sucking sound when you move it. It was distinctively reddish brown, much darker than the gray topsoil of the cemetery. This was deep earth. earth that hadn't seen the sun in a long time. I was smoothing the final pile over the gap when I slipped. My hand shot out to catch my balance, plunging palm first into the fresh mound of clay I just packed down. I yanked my hand back with a hiss of surprise. The dirt wasn't cold. It wasn't even cool. It was warm. Not the residual warmth of a sun-baked stone, but a damp, radiating heat, like the side of a feverish horse. I stripped off my work glove and touched it again with my bare fingers. The heat was unmistakable. It felt organic. It felt like body heat. I wiped my hand on my pants, leaving a smear of red mud on my thigh. Decomposition gases, I whispered, grasping for high school chemistry I barely remembered. Just methane pockets. I packed the dirt down hard with the back of the shovel, stomping on it with my boot until the blank was flat again. I tried to ignore the way the ground felt spongy under my weight, like there was a void waiting just inches beneath the surface. I threw the shovel into the truck bed with a clang that echoed too far across the valley. I didn't look in the rearview mirror as I drove back to the main office. I told myself everything was fine. I told myself I'd check it again tomorrow, and it would just be solid ground. I was wrong. I spent the daylight hours of Wednesday tossing and turning in my blackout curtains, dreaming of suffocating in red clay. When I woke up at 8:30 p.m. to get ready for my shift, it felt heavier than usual. That deep, bone-weary exhaustion you get when your brain hasn't actually rested. I arrived at Pine Ridge at 9:55 p.m. Dave, the evening guard, gave me a weird look when I walked into the break room. "You look like hell, man," he said, zipping up his jacket. "Rough night?" "Something like that," I muttered, pouring a black coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. "Hey, did groundskeeping do any work in Section 9 today?" Dave shook his head. "Nah. Crew was mowing Section 4 and 5. Nobody goes back to the Potter's Field unless we have a burial, and we haven't had a destitute burial in 6 months. Why?" "Just checking," I said. "Thought I saw some erosion near the ravine." I waited until 11:45 p.m. to go back there. I dragged it out, checking every lock on the mausoleums in sections 1 through 8 twice. But eventually, I ran out of excuses. I had to know. I parked the truck 50 yards away this time, leaving the engine running and the headlights beaming toward the blank. The bright white LEDs cut a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the gnats swarming in the humid air. My stomach dropped before I even reached the plot. I could see the shadow from the road. The hole was back. It wasn't just back. It was identical. The same perfect volcanic ring of pushed-up earth. The same dark, reddish clay that shouldn't be on the surface. But when I got close enough to shine my flashlight down into the throat of the hole, I realized it was deeper. Yesterday, it had been maybe 8 inches. Tonight, the beam of my light traveled down about 3 feet before hitting the bottom. I got down on my hands and knees, ignoring the wet grass soaking through my work pants. I needed to see the walls of the shaft. If it was an animal, a badger, a groundhog, a very determined fox, there would be claw marks. Chaotic scratching patterns where the animal had scrabbled against the earth. I leaned in, holding my breath. The walls of the hole were slick and wet, glistening in the flashlight beam. And there were marks, all right. Deep, vertical gouges ran up the sides of the clay shaft. They were rhythmic and parallel. 4 distinct grooves, evenly spaced. I slowly raised my own hand, hovering it over the opening to compare the size. A chill violently shook my shoulders. The grooves were too wide for claws. They were thick, blunt, and rounded at the bottom. They looked exactly like fingers, like someone had dug their fingers into wet cement and dragged them downward with immense strength. And the direction was wrong again. The grooves started from the bottom and streaked upward, stopping just below the surface rim. Whatever was down there wasn't digging to hide, it was climbing. I scrambled back, losing my footing and landing hard on my ass in the wet grass. The silence of the cemetery felt heavy now, pressing against my eardrums. I stared at the dark mouth of the hole, half expecting a hand to shoot out right then and there. "No," I whispered. My voice cracked. I grabbed the shovel from the truck again. This time, I didn't just fill it in. I attacked it. I slammed the clay back into the void, grunting with effort, packing it down until my shoulders burned. I stomped on the surface until it was rock hard. Then, I went to the truck bed and grabbed a heavy landscaping stone, a 50-pound slab of slate we used for edging, and dropped it directly over the spot where the hole had been. "Try getting through that," I hissed at the ground. As I drove away, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. I kept checking the rearview mirror, terrified that I'd see the stone shift. I didn't trust my eyes anymore. I needed proof. Hard, digital evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. On Thursday night, I brought my personal trail camera from home, a Browning Strike Force I usually used for deer hunting. It had a trigger speed of 0.4 seconds and decent infrared night vision. If a leaf blew across the blank, this thing would catch it. I arrived early, around 9:30 p.m., before the sun had fully set. I drove straight to Section 9. The heavy slate stone I'd placed over the plot the night before was still there, seemingly undisturbed. That gave me a momentary wave of relief, but the air still tasted wrong, metallic, and stale, like the inside of a battery. I climbed the old pin oak that stood about 20 feet from the plot. I strapped the camera to a branch about 8 feet up, angling it sharply downward, so the lens had a perfect, unobstructed view of the stone and the earth around it. I set it to video mode, 30-second clips, with the highest sensitivity. "Catch you now," I whispered, patting the plastic casing. The rest of the night was agonizing. Every time the wind rustled the trees, I jumped. I spent my shift in the main office, staring at the clock, drinking enough coffee to make my hands tremble. I forced myself not to go back there until the sky started turning gray in the east. At 5:45 a.m., just before my shift ended, I drove back to retrieve the camera. The stone was moved. It wasn't thrown or flipped. It had been slid about 6 inches to the left, just enough to expose a sliver of the dark earth beneath. My heart hammered against my ribs as I climbed the tree and unstrapped the camera. The little red light was blinking furiously, indicating the memory card was nearly full. I didn't wait to get home. I sat in the cab of my truck, locked the doors, and plugged the SD card into my laptop. My breath hitched. There were 412 video files recorded between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. That meant the camera had been triggering almost non-stop for 3 hours. I clicked the first file, timestamped 1:03 a.m., static. Just a wall of jagged, gray, and white digital noise. No image, no night vision, just chaos. I clicked the next one. Static. The next. Static. I scrolled through 50 files at random. Every single video feed was corrupted. It looked like the camera had been exposed to massive magnetic interference. Frustration boiled up in my throat. I was about to slam the laptop shut when I noticed the audio waveform at the bottom of the media player. The video was dead, but the microphone had worked. I turned the volume up to max and put on my headphones. I pressed play on a file from 2:15 a.m. At first, there was just the low hum of the wind. Then, I heard it. Thwack. A pause of about 3 seconds. Slap. Another pause. Scrape. Slap. It sounded wet. Viscerally wet. It sounded like a slab of raw meat being dropped onto a concrete floor. Or like wet clay being packed by hand. I skipped forward to a file from 3:30 a.m. The sound was faster now, more urgent. Slap, slap, thwack. And then, underneath the wet slapping sound, I heard something else. It was faint, buried deep in the digital hiss of the recording. But with the headphones on, it was undeniable. It was a voice, not speaking words, exactly. It was a low, rhythmic humming, a vibration. It sounded happy. I ripped the headphones off and threw them onto the passenger seat. The silence of the truck cab suddenly felt suffocating. I looked out the windshield at Section 9. The sun was breaking over the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows across the graves. Something down there wasn't just digging, it was working, and it was enjoying it. Technology had failed me. The camera was useless against whatever was happening in Section 9. That Friday night, I decided I had to see it with my own eyes. I needed to know the mechanics of it. I needed to see the thing holding the shovel. I parked my truck on the other side of the property, near the front gates, to make it look like I was on patrol elsewhere. Then, I walked back on foot, sticking to the tree line, moving as quietly as I could. I slipped into the old maintenance shed that sits on a slight rise about 50 yards from Potter's Field. It's a rusted corrugated metal shack where we keep bags of fertilizer and broken lawnmower parts. I dragged a stack of mulch bags to the window facing the ravine and sat down. Through the dirty, cobwebbed glass, I had a direct line of sight to the blank. I sat there for 4 hours, my legs cramped, and the cold from the concrete floor seeped into my bones. 12 a.m. passed. Then 1. Then 2. The cemetery was noisy that night. Bullfrogs were croaking from the drainage ditch, and the wind was whipping the dry leaves around. It felt normal. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the world stopped. It wasn't a gradual quiet. It was instantaneous. The wind died. The frogs cut off mid-croak. The silence was so sudden and absolute that my ears actually popped, like the cabin pressure dropping in an airplane. I sat up straighter, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then came the smell. It drifted through the cracks in the shed's metal walls. A thick, cloying scent that made my eyes water. It smelled like a handful of old, rusty pennies held under a hot faucet. It was the smell of ozone and copper, so strong I could taste it on the back of my tongue. It tasted like I was chewing on aluminum foil. I pressed my face to the glass, squinting into the gloom. The slate stone I had placed over the hole was still there, but as I watched, it didn't slide this time. It flipped. It was a 50-pound slab of rock, and it flipped into the air like a tiddlywink, landing silently in the tall grass 3 feet away. There was no hand, no lever. It just flew. And then, the earth erupted. I don't know how else to describe it. It didn't look like digging. It looked like a geyser. A fountain of dark red clay shot straight up from the ground, reaching maybe 4 feet into the air before raining down in a perfect circle. There was no sound of a shovel hitting dirt. No grunt of exertion. Just the visual violence of the earth vomiting itself up. Another burst. Then another. The pile of dirt grew rapidly, creating that same volcanic ring I'd seen the first night. The speed was impossible. Within 30 seconds, cubic feet of soil had been displaced. I was paralyzed. My breath was fogging up the glass, but I couldn't move to wipe it. I was watching physics break down 50 yards away from me. The smell of copper grew so intense, I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The pressure in the air released with a palpable whoosh, and the wind started blowing again. I stayed in that shed until the sun came up. I was too terrified to walk across the 50 yards of open grass to get back to my truck. It was 6:15 a.m. when I finally built up the courage to leave the maintenance shed. The sun was fully up, burning off the mist, and the morning birds were singing as if the laws of physics hadn't just been violated a few hours earlier. Sunlight has a way of making you feel stupid for being scared, but as I walked across the wet grass towards Section 9, the dread didn't lift. It settled in my stomach like lead. The damage to the ground was severe. The pile of displaced earth was waist-high now, a perfect cone of dark red clay that looked stark and violent against the green manicured lawn. The hole next to it was a gaping black mouth, easily 3 feet wide. I approached slowly, my boots squelching in the mud. I didn't want to look down into the hole, not yet. My eyes were drawn to the top of the dirt pile. Sitting at the very peak of the mound, balanced precariously on a clod of wet clay, was something that glittered in the morning light. It was a silver locket. It looked out of place, like a prop left on a movie set. It wasn't covered in mud. It wasn't tarnished or rusted from being buried for 100 years. It was polished to a high shine, pristine and clean. It looked like it had been placed there 5 minutes ago. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and plucked it from the dirt. The metal was ice cold against my skin, far colder than the ambient air temperature. It was an oval-shaped pendant, the kind you'd buy at a cheap jewelry store in the mall, with a delicate floral engraving on the front. I should have thrown it into the ravine. I should have walked away. But curiosity is a disease, and I had it bad. I dug my thumbnail into the catch and pried the locket open. There was a tiny, folded square of photo paper inside. It wasn't an old sepia portrait of a Victorian woman or a lock of hair. It was a modern, digital print, cut clumsily with scissors to fit the oval frame. I squinted at the image. The resolution was grainy, high-contrast black and white. It looked like a still frame from a security camera. My breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of a bedroom, messy sheets, a glass of water on the nightstand, a pile of laundry in the corner. It was my bedroom, and in the center of the bed, buried under a duvet, was a figure. A man with short, dark hair, sleeping on his side, one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress. It was me. I recognized the t-shirt I was wearing. It was the gray one with the bleach stain on the shoulder. I had worn it to bed 2 nights ago. I brought the locket closer to my face, my vision blurring with panic. The angle of the photo was impossible. It wasn't taken from the window or the door. It was taken from the upper corner of the room, right where the ceiling meets the walls, 12 feet up. There was no shelf there, no camera mount. Nothing but smooth drywall and spider webs. I spun around, scanning the tree line, scanning the empty cemetery, expecting to see someone watching me, laughing at the prank. But there was no one. Just the endless rows of silent graves and the wind rustling the oak trees. This thing wasn't just in the ground. It had been in my apartment. It had been on my ceiling while I slept. I snapped the locket shut, my palms sweating against the cold silver. I felt exposed, naked. The safe barrier between work and home had just been shattered. I didn't quit. I know how stupid that sounds. I held that silver locket in my hand, staring at a picture taken by an intruder in my own bedroom, and I didn't drive into the sunset. I couldn't. I have $400 in my bank account and rent is due on the 1st. I told myself it was a stalker, a very sick, very human stalker, and humans can be arrested. I spent the day installing 3 deadbolts on my apartment door and checking every inch of my ceiling for hidden cameras. I found nothing. I returned to Pine Ridge on Saturday night with a plan. If the hole was there, I wasn't going to engage with it. I was going to call the police and let them deal with the grave robbers. The shift started quietly. I refused to leave the main office until 3 a.m. When I finally drove the truck down to Section 9, my heart was hammering against my ribs. The hole was there. And it was worse. It was massive now, easily 6 feet deep. A yawning black rectangle that looked ready for a coffin. The pile of dirt next to it was higher than the hood of my truck. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so bad I hit the wrong button twice. 911. What is your emergency? This is the caretaker at Pine Ridge Memorial, I said, my voice rising an octave. I have extensive vandalism. Someone has dug up a grave. I think they're still here. I lied about the last part to get them to hurry. Officers are on the way, the dispatcher said. I drove back to the main gates to let them in, leaving Section 9 unobserved. It takes about 15 minutes for a cruiser to get out to our location from the town center. I sat by the gate, watching the headlights of passing cars, feeling a manic sense of relief. It was over. The cops would see the hole, they'd open an investigation, and I wouldn't have to be the crazy guy anymore. At 4:18 a.m., a cruiser pulled in. It was Officer Miller, a guy I'd waved to a few times at the local diner. He looked bored. Grave robbers, huh? He said, leaning out the window. On a Saturday? Just follow me, I said. It's bad, Miller. It's really bad. I led the way in my maintenance truck, driving fast. We wound through the dark paths, the red and blue lights of his cruiser bouncing off the marble angels. We reached the turn for Section 9, and I slammed on the brakes, pointing toward the blank. Right there, I shouted, jumping out of the truck. Look at the size of... I choked on the words. Officer Miller stepped out of his car, adjusting his belt, and shone his heavy tactical flashlight where I was pointing. Look at the size of what, son? He asked. The ground was flat. The 6-foot hole was gone. The 5-foot pile of red clay was gone. The grass was seamless, unbroken, and green. It wasn't just filled in. It looked like it had never been touched. There was no loose soil, no seam lines, no mud. I ran over to the spot, dropping to my knees. I clawed at the grass. It was rooted firmly in the earth. I scrambled around, looking for the dirt pile. Nothing. Just dew-covered clover. It was here, I stammered, looking up at Miller. I swear to God, it was 6 feet deep 20 minutes ago. Miller let out a long, tired sigh. He walked over and shone his light in my face. His pupils were small, evaluating. You working too many doubles, kid? He asked. Or are you taking something to stay awake? I'm not on drugs, I yelled, standing up. Check the trail cam. I have a trail cam. I ran to the oak tree. The strap was cut. My camera was gone. Miller shook his head. Look, don't call us unless there's a body or a fire. You're wasting resources. He got back in his car and reversed out. I stood there alone in the dark, standing on perfectly solid ground that I knew, for a fact, was hollow. Officer Miller left me standing there like a lunatic, bathed in the red glow of his taillights until they disappeared around the bend. I was alone again. I didn't go back to the office. I couldn't. The logic of the world had snapped, and I was the only one who noticed the break. If the hole could vanish in 15 minutes, that meant the earth itself in Section 9 was fluid. It was obeying something other than geology. I locked myself in the maintenance truck. I rolled up the windows, locked the doors, and kept the engine running. I drove to the far side of the property, Section 1, near the main road where the streetlights from the highway offered a pathetic amount of comfort. I decided I would sit there until 6 a.m., then drive straight to my boss's house and quit. At 2:58 a.m., my cell phone buzzed in the cup holder. I jumped, banging my knee against the steering column. I looked at the screen. Unknown caller. I ignored it. It rang again immediately. Unknown caller. I ignored it again. Then, the truck's radio, which was off, clicked on. Static hissed through the speakers, loud and angry. I fumbled for the volume knob, twisting it frantically, but the static didn't change level. Then, my phone rang a third time. I picked it up. Hello? Pick up the landline, a voice said. It wasn't a stranger's voice. It wasn't a demon or a ghost. It was my voice. It was recorded, spliced, and garbled, but the timbre was unmistakably mine. It sounded like a recording of me talking in my sleep, pitched down slightly. "Who is this?" I screamed. "The line," my own voice rasped back. The call cut off. I looked across the seat at the heavy-duty radio handset we use for dispatch. It was silent, but it didn't mean the radio. I looked out the window toward the maintenance shed in the distance. The office line. The shed had an extension phone, an old rotary unit mounted on the wall for the groundskeepers. I shouldn't have done it. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to drive through the gates and never look back. But the compulsion was physical. It was like a hook in my gut, reeling me in. I drove back to the main building, not the shed. I ran inside the main office, locking the door behind me. I stared at the desk phone. The little light for extension 4 of the shed was blinking. Someone had taken the phone off the hook down there. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. I didn't say anything. I heard breathing. It was wet, rattling breathing, like someone with fluid in their lungs. Then came the sound of dirt. Thud. Thud. Soil hitting wood. "Why?" the voice whispered on the other end. It was clearer now. "Closer. Why did you fill it in? What do you want?" I whispered back, tears stinging my eyes. "I need room," the voice said. It sounded like my mouth was full of mud. "I'm growing." There was a loud crack, like wood snapping, and then a dial tone. I slammed the phone down. I looked out the office window towards Section 9. The lights in the maintenance shed, 500 yards away, flickered on. Then off. Then on. Something was in the shed, and it had used the phone. I grabbed the longest, heaviest crowbar from the utility closet and a fresh battery for my mag light. I was done running. If this thing wanted to be me, it was going to have to fight me first. I threw the truck into gear and floored it. The tires spun on the gravel, kicking up a spray of stones as I roared out of the maintenance yard. I didn't care about the noise anymore. If something was out there, I wanted it to know I was coming. I drove straight to Section 9, my high beams bouncing wildly over the uneven ground. I skidded to a halt 10 yards from the blank, leaving the engine running and the headlights pointed directly at the plot. It was back. Of course it was back. The flat, pristine grass Officer Miller had seen less than an hour ago was gone. In its place was a scene of industrial-scale violence. The hole wasn't just a shaft anymore, it was a crater. It looked like a bomb had gone off underground. The pile of displaced clay was massive, easily 6 feet high, blocking the view of the ravine. I stepped out of the truck, the crowbar heavy in my right hand, the mag light in my left. The air was thick with that metallic ozone smell, stronger than ever. It tasted like blood and batteries. "Come on then!" I screamed at the darkness. "Show yourself!" My voice echoed off the distant trees. Nothing answered. No rustling leaves, no wet slapping sounds, just the hum of my truck engine. I walked to the edge of the pit. The ground around the rim was cracked and fissured, threatening to give way under my boots. I braced my feet and shone the flashlight down into the abyss. The beam didn't hit the bottom. It traveled down past the 3-foot mark, past the 6-foot mark. This was a grave, but it wasn't dug for a coffin. At a depth of about 8 feet, the shaft didn't stop, it turned. I leaned closer, fighting the vertigo. The hole curved sharply to the left, tunneling horizontally under the neighboring plots. I could see the ragged ends of tree roots dangling from the ceiling of the tunnel like severed nerves. And further in, I saw the bottom of a concrete burial vault from grave 104 exposed in the tunnel wall. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The entity hadn't been filling the hole in. It had been moving the dirt sideways. It was building a network. It wasn't just digging a grave. It was hollowing out the entire cemetery from below. I adjusted the angle of the light, trying to see how far the tunnel went. The beam caught wet, glistening clay walls that stretched into the darkness beneath Section 9. And on the floor of the tunnel, in the fresh mud, were drag marks. Wide, slick trails where something heavy had pulled itself deep into the earth. I was standing on top of a colony. I raised the crowbar, preparing to... do what? Smash the dirt? I felt suddenly small and stupid standing on the edge of that labyrinth. Then, from deep inside the horizontal tunnel, I heard a sound. It wasn't the wet slapping noise this time. It was the sound of a coffin lid cracking open. The sound of splintering wood and cracking concrete reverberated up the shaft, followed by a wet, dragging noise. Something was moving in the horizontal tunnel. It was coming toward the opening where I stood frozen, my flashlight beam shaking violently against the clay walls. "Who's there?" I choked out, raising the crowbar. A hand reached out of the darkness of the tunnel, gripping the edge of the vertical shaft to pull itself up. It wasn't a rotted skeletal hand. It wasn't a claw. It was a human hand. It was pale, shaking, and covered in red clay. And on the wrist, pushed back slightly, was the cuff of a gray work shirt. My gray work shirt. I watched in paralyzed horror as the figure hauled itself out of the lateral tunnel and into the bottom of the open pit. It stood up, its boots squelching in the mud. It was wearing a Pine Ridge maintenance uniform, complete with the embroidered name tag that read Matt. It was me. It was a perfect, physical copy of me, down to the way my hair was cowlicked on the left side. But the texture was wrong. The clothes didn't ripple like fabric. They moved stiffly, like they were part of the skin, molded from the same wet clay as the walls. The thing didn't look up at me immediately. It seemed focused on its task. It turned toward the exposed concrete wall of Grave 104, the plot directly next to the hole, where the corner of the burial vault was sticking out. It reached up with both hands, planting its feet in the mud. I saw the muscles in its back. My back bunch and ripple with impossible hydraulic pressure. It wasn't trying to climb out. It grabbed the edge of the concrete vault and pulled. A sound like a gunshot rang out as the concrete fractured. The entity roared a sound that was half human scream, half grinding stone, and yanked downward. The earth around the grave above shifted. The grass tore open. The entire 1,000-pound burial vault of Mrs. Edna Miller, 1924 to 1989, slid 6 inches down into the hole. The thing was undermining the cemetery. It was pulling the graves down into its tunnel system. Then, it stopped. It sensed the light. Slowly, methodically, the head snapped back. It looked straight up the shaft, directly into the beam of my maglite. The face was mine, but the expression was a slack, mindless mask. And the eyes. There were no pupils. No irises. Just 2 spheres of milky, solid white, glowing faintly in the dark. Its mouth opened, stretching too wide, the jaw unhinging with a wet pop. "Help. Me," it mimicked, using the voice I had heard on the phone. Heavy. Then it bent its knees, coiled like a spring, and launched itself up the walls of the shaft. It moved with the speed of a striking viper. 1 second it was at the bottom of the 8-foot shaft. The next, it was cresting the rim, its fingers digging into the soft earth just inches from my boots. I stumbled backward, the wet grass slick under my feet. I swung the crowbar in a blind panic, connecting with its shoulder. There was no satisfying crunch of bone, just a dull thud, like hitting a bag of wet sand. The impact didn't even slow it down. It lunged. Its hand shot out and clamped around my right ankle. The grip was absolute. It felt like a hydraulic press made of ice. The cold was instant and agonizing, burning straight through the thick leather of my work boot and searing my skin. "Stay," it gargled, the voice vibrating against the bone of my leg. "Join the clay." It yanked backward, dragging me down toward the open mouth of the pit. My other leg scrabbled uselessly for purchase. I could smell it now up close. It didn't smell like ozone anymore. It smelled like me. It smelled like my deodorant, mixed with the stench of rotting flowers and deep, stagnant earth. I screamed and kicked out with my left leg, driving the heel of my boot into its face. The face deformed under the impact, the nose flattening like putty, but the white eyes didn't blink. I kicked again, harder, screaming in primal terror. The laces of my right boot, already strained from the pull, snapped with a sharp pop. I felt my foot slide free. The thing flew backward, clutching my empty boot to its chest, and tumbled back down into the darkness of the shaft. I didn't wait to see it land. I scrambled to my feet, slipping and sliding, running on one boot and one sock. The gravel of the path tore into my foot, but the adrenaline masked the pain. I threw myself into the cab of the truck and slammed the door, locking it instantly. I fumbled with the gear stick, jamming it into drive, and floored the accelerator. The tires squealed, finding traction on the asphalt path. As I sped away, I made the mistake of looking in the rearview mirror. The floodlights from the truck swept across Section 9 one last time. The entity wasn't chasing me. It didn't need to. The entire section was moving. It looked like the earth was boiling. Dozens of graves from the Pauper's Field all the way up to the edge of the 1,950 seconds plots were sinking. The grass was tearing open in jagged, concentric circles. Headstones were tilting and sliding backward, swallowed by the ground as the tunnels beneath them collapsed. I saw the ground ripple, a massive wave of earth rolling toward the ravine, dragging the history of the town down with it. I didn't stop at the gate. I didn't stop at the office. I drove until the gas tank was empty. I didn't go back for my boot. I didn't go back for my final paycheck either. At 7:02 a.m. that morning, I sent a text to the ground supervisor. I quit. Do not contact me. Do not come to my apartment. Then I blocked his number, threw my SIM card out the window on the highway, and drove 3 towns over to my sister's place. By the time the news crews got to Pine Ridge, the official story had already been constructed. Catastrophic sinkhole, they called it. The local paper ran a piece about unstable limestone bedrock and water drainage issues. They said 50 graves had been displaced. They didn't mention the tunnels. They didn't mention that the graves hadn't fallen random. They had been pulled. I moved into a complex called the Vistas in Lexington. I specifically chose a second-floor unit. I needed to be separated from the earth. I needed wood, subflooring, and concrete between me and the soil. For 6 months, I haven't stepped on grass. I walk on pavement, I drive on asphalt, and I stay inside. I thought I was safe. I thought distance and altitude were enough to break the connection, but I was wrong. Yesterday morning, I woke up with a taste in my mouth that made me gag. It was that same thick metallic flavor ozone and old pennies. My throat felt raw, like I'd been screaming, or swallowing something dry. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and my hands felt rough. I looked down at my fingers. Packed deep under every fingernail, jammed into the cuticle so tight it hurt, was dark, red clay. My heart stopped. I scrambled out of bed, backing away toward the door, and that's when I saw it. In the center of my bedroom, right on top of the beige carpet, was a pile of dirt. It was small, maybe 6 inches across, but it was unmistakable. It was formed in a perfect, volcanic ring, pushed up from below. I fell to my knees and crawled over to it. I pulled back the rug. There was no hole in the floorboards. The wood was solid. The subflooring was intact. There was no physical way for dirt to come up through the floor of a second-story apartment, but the wood was warm. I put my hand on the spot, and I could feel it, a faint, rhythmic vibration. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was the sound of something digging, miles away, or perhaps dimensions away, using me as a beacon. I understand now why the thing in the hole had my face. It wasn't just copying me. It was waiting for me. I left a part of myself down there. My boot, my sweat, my blood from the blisters. And now, I think a part of it is in me. I'm gonna go buy a shovel. Not to fill it in. I don't think I have a choice anymore. I think I have to help it dig.